Hi, in this topic objectives 2.5, we're going to be talking about sources of regulations. When we talk about sources of regulation, just to be very clear here, it actually means the level of regulations, where these regulations come from and how enforceable are they. All right. So for a start, you have to know what is a primary legislation. All right, this is the first source. Right, this is the highest level, right, of any laws. Right, it's a primary source of law of a jurisdiction. It's the main legislation, right, often known as a statutory law. All right, in English legal system, we usually refer it to as an act. Right, so in the financial industry, you have the MAS Act, you have the Banking Act, you have Securities and Futures Act, which we hear very often, and we're going to hear it more often later. Insurance Act, Financial Advisors Act, right, which governs how financial advisors are supposed to behave. So these are like the main legislation, the bigger piece. Then you will have a secondary legislation, which is basically the rest of the regulations that is a legislation that is from this primary legislation, right? So the primary legislation set the framework, right, and the secondary legislation becomes the how you fill up this primary legislation. Let's say, for example, in a sports game, right? If I were to draw analogy, right, it can be that for example, in basketball, technical fouls, right? Technical fouls are the large, how you enact, right? How you govern, and then under technical fouls, you can be stating the secondary legislation on what constitute a technical foul. If you do this, then this is a technical foul. You can't do this is a technical foul. So the rest of the details, it becomes secondary, right? So if you look at what acts, all right, what legislation that is under the purview of MAS, there are these, right? Just now I mentioned some of them: MAS Act, Banking Act, Securities and Futures Act, Insurance Act, so on and so forth. You can see the last one, which is called the Payment Services Act. This is started in January 2019. This is basically enacted because of the payment services here in Singapore that is evolving, right? We have PayNow, PayLah, and all those things. So Payment Services Act really is an act that was passed through the Parliament, right, in order to govern how these payment services should be regulated, right? So let us quickly just go through what are the different acts and what do they really do. Okay, we are going through some of the common ones so that you understand. So in banking, right, activities in banking, general banking services, all these are under the authority of the Banking Act, right? So if you have a banking business, if you receive money on current and deposit account, if you can pay and collect checks drawn by or paid in by customers, making advances to customers, as you can see, all these are basic banking services, right? These are governed under the Banking Act. All right, this is not license. So banking have banking license, and under this license, right, the activities that's done under all their banking activities, right, is governed under the authority of Banking Act, right? And the next one, which is also very common, Insurance Act, right? These are basically insurance business, right? If you are a bank, or if you are insurance company that receives proposal for policies in Singapore, you issue policies, you collect premiums, you receive premium on policies. All these insurance business are governed under or regulated under the authority of the Insurance Act. The next one is capital market services, all right, under the Securities and Futures Act. This is one of the more common one that you hear about, right, when you do trading, right? Capital market, for example, all right. So holders of all these license, this capital market service license, can be involved in the following activities, business activities, all right. When you deal with securities, you trade futures contracts, you have forex trading, you advise on corporate finance, you do fund management, you do REITs, you do securities financing, you do credit rating, and you provide custodial services for securities. All these activities that is allowable under the capital market service licenses are regulated under the authority of SFA, Securities and Futures Act. The next one you have is the Financial Advisors Act. Just now I mentioned very quickly, right? So under this Financial Advisors Act, this is really regulated activities for financial advisors. So if this company provide financial advisory services according to the 4 bullet points here, where you advise others either directly or indirectly through publication, writings, electronic form, non-electronic form, advising others through using research reports, right? And you market collective investment scheme. Collective investment scheme example of that is unit trust. You arrange a contract of insurance, basically when you advise, right? All these are all financial advisory services. So under the authority of Financial Advisors Act, there are a stipulated set of rules and regulations on how you conduct business as a financial advisor, right? So when we look at more into secondary legislation, right? Just now I mentioned already, it subsumes under the relevant act, the primary legislation, right? Or we call it flesh on the bones, right? If the bones is the primary legislation, then the secondary legislation are really the flesh on the bones. Okay, both the primary legislation and the secondary legislation has a force of law. When it is a force of law, it means that any contravention, any breach of this legislation will constitute a criminal offense. All right. So just to note, right, the 4th point, it says that it's easier to change than primary legislation. What does it mean? It means that if I want to change the whole banking act, I want to take away the whole banking act, for example, it is so difficult because there is so many regulations that are already established under this primary legislation. But if you have secondary legislation, which are really the flesh on the bones under the authority of this primary legislation, it's much easier to amend, right? It's much easier to change it so that it suits the business at the point of time. But the primary legislation is definitely more difficult to change because it is the main legislation itself. All right. So example is finance companies advertisement regulation. These are secondary legislation, okay, that is put onto the Finance Companies Act, for example, and this specifically talks about advertisements, how advertisements should be regulated, right, under the Finance Companies Act, right? So while we are at this, I'm going to introduce to you some other sources of regulations that has different levels of enforcement here in Singapore. All right, you should be familiar with some of them. Directions, okay, under direction there are directives, notices, then you have guidelines, you have codes, you have practice notes, and you have circulars. There's so many regulatory instruments here. Just now we talk about takeover codes, right? It's right here, all right, codes. So we will talk about very quickly how these are, why is there so many different regulatory instruments. I mean, you other than primary legislation and the secondary legislation, you need all these different regulatory instruments to help the industry, right? So let's move on to directives. Okay, directives are legal binding. It means it has a force of law as well, right? On specified person or financial institution. So it is like the word suggests, is a directive. I can issue a directive straight onto a certain person or financial institution to tell them that these are legal binding requirements you have to follow. This will be very different from the secondary legislation or primary legislation that we talked about earlier, because secondary legislation and primary legislation, they apply to everyone. All right, it is a law. Anybody who breaks this law, all right, will constitute a criminal offense, right? But these directives are really on specified person or financial institution. All right, this is specified. The next one you have are notices. Okay, notices, they are legal binding requirements again, but it's on a specified class of financial institutions or persons, right? Example, if I have MAS Notice 626, okay, this is the most common one that we have. It is on the prevention of money laundering and countering of financing of terrorism, okay, AML or CFT. So this these binding requirements they are notices that are given to a specified class of financial institution on a specific class of legislation, right? Money laundering in this case, right? Then you have MAS Notice 603, which is really investment linked policies, right? It's a specific class, right? Then you have guidelines. Guidelines sets out best practice standards. They are, as the word suggests, they are guidelines. Okay, it governs the conduct of all specified institutions or persons. It must be noted that at this point, when it comes to guidelines, if there's any contravention, it is not a criminal offense. Right? I repeat again. So if you breach guidelines, it is not a criminal offense. But if you breach the guidelines, you will get reprimanded. I mean, you are so-called, I mean, it is about the reputation, right? If you don't follow certain guidelines, your business will be affected based on your reputation, because people will know that, oh, this bank actually, or this financial institution actually, breach certain guidelines. But they are not criminal offenses such that they constitute a fine or criminal offense where you need to go to jail. Okay, so these are guidelines. They are encouraged to be observed. So like I said, right, reputation, it has an impact on MAS overall risk assessment on the institution, right? MAS, knowing that you have breached this certain guideline, I mean, the risk assessment on you will be very poor, right? So example of some guidelines are technology risk management guidelines for financial institution. These are really guidelines to help financial institution to manage technology risk, right? It is not a law. If they don't do the risk management properly, it does not constitute to a criminal offense. It basically just means that they do not have the best practice, right? So these guidelines, if breached, it's not a criminal offense, or rather, it will affect the risk assessment on this particular financial institution, right? You also have guidelines on standards of conduct for insurance brokers. You also have FAA guidelines. FAA means Financial Advisors Act. Guidelines on fair dealing. Okay, there are certain way that you need to certain behavior you need to observe as a guideline. The next one are codes, right? Codes. Just now we talked about takeover codes. It set up a system of rules that govern the conduct of specified activities. Specified activities. Again, codes do not have a force of law. It's non-statutory, do not have a force of law. If you breach it, it is not a criminal offense. You cannot use a code and say that I'm going to arrest you because you have breached the code. No. All right. But breach of code has certain consequences. You will have been reprimanded by MAS or public censure. What's public censure? Basically, it tells everyone that you have breached this code, right? It's like, I mean, with the word code, you can imagine it like, like in the pugilistic world, in the martial arts world, you have a certain code, right? To go, but it is not a criminal offense if you break the code. It just means that you do not have, you have a bad reputation, right? If you break those code, right? So some of the examples, takeover code, like I said, code on collective investment scheme. Okay, as we go down the list, you will realize that it is less and less enforceable, and it's less and less serious, all right, in the sense of note, inverted commas. So the next one we have is practice notes. Okay, these are guide, all right? These are guides for specified institution or person on certain administrative procedures, all right? Licensing, for example, reporting and compliance matter. There are these really practice note that tells the financial institution, on how to conduct the business, right? Practice note. So again, practice note, if there's a breach, it's not a criminal offense, right? But if it is required by an act, obviously, if it's stated as a primary legislation or secondary legislation, then of course, it will constitute to a criminal offense. Examples, practice note on lodgement of documents relating to offers of shares and debentures. These are really more detailed already, when it comes to procedures that the banking professional need to adhere to, right? Then you have circulars. Okay, circulars are documents that are really circulated among, the industry, sent to a specified persons for their information and published in a website for public information. There's no legal effect. All right, this is just some information that needs to be disseminated down to these industry people, right? So for example, MES circular to banks on outsourcing of cash and check related transactional service to another bank. So it is really very specific. Okay, it's just a circular out there, you know, to tell people, to inform people on certain information. Okay. So other regulatory requirements, okay, you have industry guidance. Just now actually we talked about IMAS having certain code of ethics, right? Guidance notes. These are also examples of regulatory sources, but they are not enforceable by law as well, right? We are also interested in the SGX rules rulebook. This rulebook, again, because it is not under a primary legislation, is really enforced by SGX. So SGX has the responsibility to enforce them and provide those punishment under the rule, right? But even if they breach, again, it is not a criminal offense. It's basically rules that SGX have set, and if breach, SGX have the responsibility to set up certain punishment, right, based on the rulebook. So at this point, I have actually covered the different sources of regulations. So just as a very quick quiz for you to answer in the Padlet, just help me to list down, right, the sources for regulation that has legal effects. It should be simple to you if you have watched this video. So just look through again. Okay, if you don't know, you can re-watch this video and list down the sources of regulation that has legal effects in Padlet itself. Right, so this is the end of topic 2. So I'll see you next time in topic 3. Bye.